the format for this session is that I'm going to have a short attempt to, not to summarize actually, but to provoke you. And then we're going to have an open panel discussion, which I think, Farida, you will then come up and facilitate. So I should say a little bit about my own background and the approach that I'm bringing to this kind of synthesis stroke provocation. Migration is a central part of my research, but in a very different way to ways we've been discussing here. I work on international development, and I particularly work on dynamics of inequality and violence, and it's actually, migration has emerged as a central topic in my research rather than being one of the pioneering or the driving questions behind it. So I came to see the importance of migration in my research, although I didn't start out looking at migration. Having said that, the types of migration I look at are very different to the kinds of thing we've been talking about here. Mostly low-skilled migration, mostly state-sponsored or even forced migration, mostly within countries rather than between countries, and mostly in poor countries rather than wealthy countries. And so one of the things I've been reflecting on as I listen here is the differences and the similarities between scholars thinking about and trying to understand migration to a very wealthy part of the world in comparative terms, and the kinds of concerns that inform the literature on and the experiences of migration in the developing world. One of the other things that sort of is driving the comments here is to think about what we can do with this kind of conference in terms of moving forwards. And I think it's been said before, I will say it again, this kind of conference, what's so fantastic about it is that it brings together the academics, the policymakers, the community workers, the unions, into a discussion that informs each other. And I think one of the things we could perhaps try to think about in this final session is how we can go forward from this in terms of thinking of pathways that we can take that mutual impact together forward. The UK, you may have guessed, I've arrived from the UK, and quite recently, about 6 months ago, has a very clear impact agenda, and academics in the UK are very used to now working with policymakers and stakeholders in a very different way than I think is the norm here. And one of the things I think we need to take from this is the idea that academia and policy, the policy arena, broadly speaking, not just community, not just government, but also communities. Academia here, it seems to me, we're here to be your critical friend. So we're not, academia in some cases is contracted by government bureaus to do particular pieces of research, and that's fine. We also sit at the sidelines and shout at you about what we think you're doing wrong based on our own research. That's also fine. But what's often underdeveloped is the kind of the critical collaboration between other stakeholders and academics to develop programs of research that are both intellectually stimulating and also of policy use, in a way that's not simply answering a straightforward question, but hopefully opening up new avenues for research as well. So I said I was going to provoke, and I will provoke by starting off with two words that it seems to me have not been suitably represented in the discussions today. And before I come to this, I should prefigure it by saying that overall I've found it a fantastically enjoyable day, and lots of insightful, very interesting presentations, but everyone's a bit sleepy, so I'm going to be provocative to keep everyone awake for the next final session. I had three words that had not been spoken about much, but one of them was raised just now, the issue of remittances, so that's off my agenda. And the two that I had, which are central to debates about migration in international development, are inequality and gender. And it seems to me that in terms of thinking about the issues that face handling and the experiences of migrants in Western Australia, these issues have been alluded to, but they haven't been front and centre in the way that I would perhaps like them to be. So perhaps one of the issues we can discuss moving forward is how we can put those two issues of gender and inequality front and centre. More generally, when I think about the different studies we've heard today, we've seen some studies around, we've been broadly split into economic studies and social studies. And again, within the context of a conference like this, that's a perfectly reasonable organizing principle through which to shape our discussions. But one of the things we might like to do is start breaking down those divides between social questions and economic questions, because it seems to me that they're very fundamentally linked, the questions of social cohesion and economic trajectories. And to that extent, I had a sort of a kind of a pretend title for this little summary. If I was to sort of summarize the general flavor of what came out, it seemed to me that the basic message we got was migration is good for Australia, but not so good for the migrants. Right, so particularly from the economic studies, we saw a lot of very positive stories about how we're managing skilled migration very well. But then when we started to look at the experience of migrants, particularly often the lower skilled migrants, we saw some not quite so positive stories coming out. So that kind of goes to the point that Graham Hugo was making on that video, that this is a very complex topic which we can't simplify, and we shouldn't try to simplify too much. And one of the reasons I think one of the reasons why we might have seen this divide is because what struck me when we were reflecting on the difference between the economic studies we've been looking at and the more social studies is that the economic studies are very much looking at the immediate impact. So I think our speaker from Melbourne, I'm sorry, my names have slipped me, was talking specifically about how we're looking at immediate uptake of skills. This is what we're interested in from an economic perspective. But of course, from a social perspective, what we're often interested in is the long-term impact on people, the long-term lived experience of people over their lifetimes and then into second and third generations. And that bridging this gap between pulling people in, to me, there was almost a sense that the economic system is working because we have a system that slots people into the right place in the economy. Right, we've got our visa system working beautifully, and I've got a PhD, and so I can slot straight into permanent residency in a good job, and I'm going to be employed in Australia until I get my superannuation, and other people will slot into different areas. And from a sort of economic perspective, that works fantastically. But for the social perspective, obviously, there's many more questions that we need to ask and understand. So bringing together that sort of immediate, synchronous economic focus to understanding the longitudinal focus. And it was interesting to hear that there is, I'm not an expert on Australia, that there is a longitudinal economic study of migration in Western Australia or in Australia, but whether one thing we might want to think about taking forward is a kind of some kinds of work around a longitudinal qualitative study. Start to think about how we can actually start tracking the experiences of migrants in a systematic way. This work may already be being done. And that reflected a sort of a broader division, I think, as well, in terms of the use of the word mobility. And the fact that we've got two different, I mean, there's many different concepts of mobility that we've been talking about, but it seemed to me there were two particularly prominent ones within the discussions today. The first is the idea of global mobility, right? This idea that there is now a kind of a transnational global class of people who are moving around from place to place, often originating from mainland China, coming to higher education institutions, and this has been a focus of a lot of sociological work. People like Hugh Lauder talking about the emergence of a transnational class with either a foot in no place or feet in many places. So that sense of a globally mobile population versus the old-fashioned idea of social mobility within a society, and how migrants move and their families after them move up and down within a society. And again, I think this cuts across to those initial issues that I raised about gender and inequality. So I mean no disrespect by this when I refer back to the minister and his life story. And his life story, the reason I refer to this is because in some ways it very much parallels mine. He is a OECD educated chap who has come to Australia and made a career in Australia, and he is married to a Malaysian woman. That's also been my story. In both cases, it's still the white men who are doing best, right? So that issue of gender and inequality and social mobility, now this is anecdotal, but it did strike me when he was talking that these issues of social mobility are still old-fashioned basic concepts of race and gender, and who gets the peach plums, are still pushing through even in the sort of more positive world that we're talking about today. A couple of other issues that I thought worth just highlighting as interesting areas that it seemed to me where more work could be done to sort of build bridges. The first was this idea that was mentioned a couple of times about sort of second-order diasporas. The idea that now migration is not just, we're not just seeing diasporas, but we're seeing those diasporas move. So that we're seeing the Indian diaspora or the South Asian diaspora relocate to Western Australia. And it seems to me, just from my impressions, that Western Australia and Perth is a particular place where this is a very strong phenomena. So the Chinese Malaysians, again, you know, I mean, frankly, most of them are desperate to get out of Malaysia, as far as I can tell, for fairly good reasons. But the Chinese Malaysian population, and of course the Chinese Malaysians are themselves diaspora, a very long embedded diaspora. But so that idea that Perth has become a kind of home to a lot of second order diasporas, where you have these global communities that are then reconverging, at least to some extent, on this city that was once a parochial backwater, as I was constantly told when I told my friends in the UK that I was moving here. The other issue that I think, again, this is an issue which is quite prevalent in the development studies literature discussions around refugees and asylum now, which has been another issue on the sideline. And I think we also should be looking to sort of break this down a little bit, is the distinction between economic and political refugees, or rather economic migrants and political refugees. So Andrew Marcus, your distinction between the Syrian problem and the boat people problem, the idea that these are separate problems, I think you're entirely right in terms of the way that they are politically constructed. But if we are to take a normative view and look at these populations and whether they are deserving of our welcome in this country, then it's much less clear to me that there is a very clear distinction. Because the old-fashioned distinction that political migrants, people who move because of political harm, are refugees, they need asylum, they are welcome, it is our responsibility to accept them, but that people who are suffering desperate impoverishment are not welcome or are not automatically welcome. We have no obligation to welcome them into our societies. Seems to me one that is very problematic, and one that a lot of work in international development is trying to break down. I think I will end my comments there. Our panel, if I just give a brief introduction to the panel, or perhaps Farida, as you know them, maybe you should do that. So would you like to come up and navigate our conversation?
Thanks so much, Graham, for your summary. That's wonderful. We're missing Rebecca and Chloe. We're also going to be on this panel. Oh, they had to leave? Okay, so that's fine. And we only have about, realistically, about 10 or 12 minutes. So, without further ado, do we have any questions or any comments? Yep. Glenn, yeah.
If I may, if I just sort of answer a couple of things that Graham said. You mentioned that maybe we have a perfect immigration program and everything, you know, is going sweet. There's no such thing as a perfect immigration program. It's always something which is always going to be evolving. I sort of remember back to the 1970s when all of a sudden there was a group of people who had left Australia, Australian-born people who had gone overseas at the end of World War II as war brides or war husbands after marrying US, in particular, military personnel. They had taken out American citizenship. Their partners had either died or they'd divorced. And because they'd taken out foreign citizenship, they had no right of return to Australia. And it took a number of years before a visa category was included for former residents or former citizens of Australia. Even now, under the Family Migration Program, there are a couple of streams of visas in the family reunion category, notably some of the parents that have waiting periods of 10, 15 years, and even for the age-dependent relative has a waiting period of 56 years. So they have to be of retiring age to apply, so they'll have to be in their 120s by the time that they come up for a visa. So there are always going to be some issues. Some other things that, just in terms of assumptions, can be dangerous. Not all overseas students want to stay in Australia. a lot of them come into Australia to get their qualifications, to go back and actually have a higher standard of life and employment in their home country. A lot of Asia's leaders at different times have been overseas students in Australia. So thank God they didn't stay here, because otherwise we would have lost those connections. The same with 457s. They don't all want to stay in Australia. Quite a lot of them are here as part of a global workforce, particularly in like the oil and gas sector. So they're here to do a job and then they move on to the next continent where they're doing their work. Or they're here to make money for a period of time and then go home and be able to enjoy their life as a result of that. A bit like FIFO. So just a couple of comments that I wanted to make.
If you brief response.
Let me just briefly respond on the issue of Australia's perfect immigration programme. I was saying that slightly tongue-in-cheek, but within the context of having moved here 6 months ago from a country where, both in terms of the policy debate and the general attitudes towards migration, it is so diametrically opposed. And it is really, in terms of thinking relatively, and I think this was the point that Professor Marcus made right at the beginning, looking at Australia compared to other countries, and we've heard many of the problems that have faced particular communities and particular classes of workers. But the general tenor of the debate around migration and multiculturalism here is so staggeringly different and refreshing compared to the UK. So it's not perfect, but certainly I think the debate is a much more, not just at a higher level, but more positively focused debate here.
Thanks. I wanted to give the opportunity to both Tim and to Maria, who haven't actually spoken today and who have been very helpful members of the steering committee for this conference. So can I give, Tim had his hand up, so Tim the mic first and then Maria.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I will add my agreement that we don't have a perfect immigration system. I think that's fairly well established. But I'd just like to pick up on one of the dangerous words that Graham came up with, which was inequality. And specifically, we've got a dichotomy about inequality within societies, or as in within nation states, and inequality between nation states. And we have within nation states, when we want to address inequality, we have a reasonably well-established policy toolkit, if I could put it like that. We do know a bit about how to redistribute wealth. We do know a bit about what ensures that there's sort of rising levels of income and things like that. And those have very much evolved over the decades within the context of the nation state. Now, what we've heard a lot today is stuff about how we have this global workforce now, and sort of people are moving all over the place, and so sort of nation states and borders, they don't mean the same thing. They're not quite as important as what they once were, and things like that. Well, maybe. But the point remains that if we're going to sort of do away with those sorts of, if we're going to do away with the nation-state structure, then we're in severe danger of doing away with a lot of the policies that basically have evolved social protections. And the question remains sort of, what do we put in their place, or what's going to ensure that social protections remain? And really, so far what we have is some, in our view, rather spurious grounds to think that international agreements like sort of free trade agreements and things like that are going to sort of take the place of that, because they can sort of redistribute on a global level. Our view, the view of the trade union movement is that they don't do that. And, and we never think in terms of, rather than having a free trade agreement with a fairly weak labour rights chapter, why don't we have a labour rights agreement with a free trade chapter? We don't think of those things in terms of transnational labour rights, or we rarely do.
Thanks, Tim.
We've heard a lot of conversations here today about migration and the different issues. Being a first-generation migrant myself here, Some of the stories, I must say, are quite similar to those that I experienced, and I shared that with one of my colleagues here today. Looking at the mobility of migrants, I remember my father migrating here in the mid-50s. Within the time span of 4 or 5 years, he came back to Europe twice. So, and there are significant settlement issues that we see today, which may be a little different because of the migration groups that are coming here, but not too dissimilar to those of that period of time. It would be helpful. I think Loretta's done a lot of research in some of the European migrants that came here and some of the new and emerging migrants from Italy especially. It'd be interesting to do a comparison there to see how those issues do vary. I see some similarities there, and also the long-term impact on from a social perspective on migration. From my work that I've done over many, many years, it can vary also between the individual. There are people that have migrated here, been here for 30, 40 years, and still come to me and say, I don't know where I belong. And there are others that will be here for a short period of time and say, this is home. So I think this can be also an individual perspective on how they settle. And the mobility, I believe this is something that when you are a migrant, it's something that's there within us. It's quite often part of the process of migration, of feeling that this is home. For some people, Australia may never be home. So I think there's some of those aspects we also have to come to terms with. For today, I see there are quite significant issues from an economic and a political migrants that we have here, which is presenting a lot of issues on government and policymakers, how to move forward. However, I believe to reach social cohesion, we need to start firstly to look at respecting one another and accepting one another and giving one another that sense of belonging, regardless colour, faith, race.
Thanks, Maria. Is there any further commentary or questions? And they'll have to be really short.
I think the other issues maybe missed by some is whether is you coming to Australia by choice or forced displacement, because this issue seems to me like have been seen by others as a probably choice or you don't have the choice. I just give you example. I was a refugee 21 years ago. I have no choice. I've been moved by the American from my city to the Saudi Arabia in the desert to live there for 2 years, and overnight I became, instead of my name, became a number in the United Nations, and I've been called by this number until I come to Australia. And until now, if I need to go to probably renew my passport, I have to bring my visa. So it's always bring me back to the negative things or the traumatized time. And we need to stop that in a way where we need to look forward positive rather than bring me back to where I come from. So I think that's why I think those negative things, yes, may be seen by some as a process, but for the person that's come here by choice or by force because they got no choice, it is an issue and is a long-term issue. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
It's just a comment following up from what you just said here. I moved over here from the UK as a migrant 16 years or so ago, grew up in the countryside in England, and to be honest, moving into a city for work purposes in the UK was much more difficult And I was, I felt much more of an alien than I ever have done moving here. Moving here, integration was much easier, much more welcoming, and I'd much rather live in Australia than any city in the UK.
Okay, well, that's probably a nice place to finish. Thank you. Okay, I'm sorry we're having to rush. I just want to say a few final words to conclude. So first of all, can we please thank our panel? And we can carry on this discussion outside, but we do need to vacate the room in about 2 minutes. So just to finish, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your contributions. And as we mentioned, we'll hopefully continue this as an annual event. We've had a thoughtful and provocative day, and I'm sure everyone is tired and ready to go home. It's my pleasure once again to thank our keynote speakers, Professor Lesley Ann Hawthorne and Professor Andrew Marcus, for stimulating our panels with such interesting facts, figures and ideas. Please accept these small tokens of appreciation that Charmaine will give to you. Thank you. We also had gifts for our visitors from across the Nullarbor, Evan Lewis and Chloe Bird, but unfortunately they've had to leave. So thank you to them as well for coming across. Thanks also to all of our panel members for their considered responses, and to my colleagues for sharing their research expertise. I'm sure you will agree that some of the key issues of public debate, temporary migration, asylum seekers, refugees, questions of belonging, visa challenges, broader national and global trends have been canvassed here today, and we hope you leave with a deeper understanding of some of these issues. We have appreciated the support of the senior members of our institution, who clearly recognise the importance of connecting the university with government and the community, as well as the significance of migration for Western Australia. As noted, our long-term goal is to ensure that public debate on migration and settlement is informed by high-quality research, and we've made an excellent start today. I would also like to thank our student volunteers, Charmaine, Katrina, Renata, and Adele. If you can we please give you a vote of thanks. And also particularly to our steering committee members, Greg Wallace, Peter Ryan, Serena King, Gary Fitzgerald, Jodie Wallace, Rebecca Ball, Helen Maddox, Justin Kwok, Andrew Knox Kaniki, Carmelita Baldassar, Maria Bunn, Daniel Keeley, and Tim Diamond. And their contributions you've seen throughout the day. So thank you very much to all of those people. Finally, I would particularly like to thank my co-conveners, Associate Professor Loretta Baldassar and Dr. Danella Caspers, who it has been wonderful to work with. We thank you for coming. We look forward to seeing you again next year to carry on Graham Hugo's legacy. Oh, and please fill out your evaluation forms with suggestions. Thank you.